And we're back. In this video, we're going to go over some of the new features of MIDI Goblin. This includes the new, bigger screen, the endless encoder, the user-defined buttons, new arpeggiator modes, sequencer swing, the MIDI controller, MIDI triggers, patch morphing, and pre-ordering. I want to keep this video short, so just consider this a brief overview of some of the new features of MIDI Goblin. Let's start with the screen. MIDI Goblin's got a better screen now. It's bigger, and it has a significantly higher refresh rate than the previous version. This prevents bottlenecking and allows MIDI Goblin to run a lot smoother. It does cost more, and will affect MIDI Goblin pricing down in the future, but it's very much worth the extra couple bucks. Next up, we have the endless encoder. The encoder can be used to navigate windows, change values, name files faster, and it's got a nice little feature. It's got a button built into it. This brings the MIDI Goblin's official button count to 16. Speaking of buttons, let's talk about the user-defined buttons. You get 3 of them now instead of just 2. The user-defined buttons can be used to load patches, sequences, toggle apps on or off, or even send a MIDI panic message. This turns off all the apps and turns off all the notes as well, just in case you run into a bug or if you accidentally unplug something or change a MIDI channel while you're performing. Speaking of file names, I've actually increased the character limit for patch files, sequences, and remap files, as well as device names, to 20. Speaking of patches, not much has changed so far. I have not implemented batch patch loading at this point in time. I got some ideas on how to do it. I have, however, added the ability to change the MIDI channel your patch is actually transmitted on. This can be changed through the MIDI channels option in the settings menu. On that note, you can actually change the MIDI channel for all of MIDI Goblin's apps individually. This way you can have the sequencer playing on one synth and the auto chord running on another while sending patches to another all at once. Pretty cool. That's a good segue to multitasking. You can multitask with MIDI Goblin. You can actually run the sequencer, the arpeggiator, the auto chord, the MIDI LFO all at the same time. Mixing auto chord with arp note sounds pretty cool. The arpeggiator, arp note, and the sequencer can all have their own separate tempos and run at different speeds at the same time. And I've actually added a setting for the arpeggiator that syncs its time to the sequencer's time so things play in harmony. It sounds pretty cool. Speaking about the arpeggiator, there's been a lot of changes to that. There's been a latch mode added. It's pretty simple. You just press a note and it gets added to the arpeggio. Press that note again, it gets removed from the arpeggio. You can actually set the maximum number of notes in the arpeggio as well. This allows you to play an arpeggio with one hand or latched while playing a lead over top of it with your other hand. Pretty cool. There's also been new modes added, such as left-right, right-left, left, right, left, and random. I'm also working on something called Goblin mode. Don't know if I'll go into much detail on that here, but maybe I'll just keep it a surprise, but there will be another mode called Goblin mode down the road. You also may have noticed that the arpeggiator actually has a second MIDI out channel. This allows you to play an arpeggio with one hand or latched on one synth while outputting your lead to another synth. It's kind of a niche market. I don't know who's going to find it useful, but it's pretty easy to implement, so I just threw it in there anyways. Next up, let's talk about more changes to the sequencer. On top of now being semi-polyphonic, there's been the tie mode and the ring out mode added as well. But I've also added something new called swang. It allows you to change the length of each individual step in the sequence. To change the swanginess of a step, just select the step you want to swang, press the No button, then swang it left or right to make it shorter or longer. If you sync the arpeggiator to the sequencer, it will actually use this new swanginess for the arpeggio notes as well. The sequencer can also be programmed without a keyboard now too, which is pretty cool. You just select a step within the sequence, press the encoder button, and turn the knob. If the sequence isn't currently playing, you'll actually be able to hear the note that is being programmed. If the sequence is playing, I've set it up so that this happens silently. This way you've got some playback while you're editing and it doesn't sound all fucked up. It's kind of like a MIDI controller for the sequencer. Oh yeah, I've also added a MIDI controller too. Using the MIDI controller app, users can add and name parameter values and then use the MIDI Goblin to send those MIDI CC messages as well. I haven't added a way to save these user-defined MIDI controllers yet. I'm working on it. Seems doable, but if you want to use the MIDI controller app to, say, control your synthesizer, and you've already added your synth to the MIDI controller, MIDI Goblin can just import your synth's settings to the MIDI controller app. Basically, all you gotta do is press the menu button and set Use Device to Yes. A new list gets generated using your synthesizer's parameter values, and you just use the up, down, left, right buttons to navigate around and use the encoder to change the MIDI CC values of those parameters. It's pretty cool. It's actually really useful if you want to program an NTS1 that has a crappy interface with a nice little MIDI controller thingamabob. You can also save the patches that you've created using the MIDI controller device using the patch menu. It's pretty cool, and it's really useful for programming synths that don't have MIDI output. And if you want to switch back to that user-defined list that you were setting up, you just go back to the menu and then you set Use Device to No, and it switches back automatically. Disclaimer on this though, it currently only works for MIDI CC messages. I haven't implemented NRPN yet, but I got an idea of how I can do it, so I'm going to try to figure that out. It's going to take some time though, but at the very least we have MIDI CC MIDI controllers going on MIDI Goblin now. Oh, little pingos triggered. Trigger alert. I've also added a new feature called Trigger. If the 3 user-defined buttons aren't enough, you can actually use triggers to do all the same things that the buttons can do. All you need to do is press the plus button, then set the MIDI number and MIDI value, and then set the function that you want the trigger to do. It's quite useful if you have a MIDI controller with a bunch of buttons and you want to send patches when you press those buttons or something, or turn on or off apps. You can also hook up, say, a MIDI stomp box, and when you stomp on the button, it sends a patch or turns on or off an app. It's pretty useful, pretty cool. A lot of people ask for it, so it's in there, and you can have up to 99 triggers. Another thing that was suggested was morphing. Morph works by analyzing your synth's current parameter values and then analyzing the values of a patch, and then as you turn your encoder knob, it morphs all the values that you currently have to those patch values. I can use morph by selecting the patch I want to morph to and then just turning that knob. If you like the way things sound while you're mid-morph, just hit the back button, go back to the patches menu, and save your patch. It'll actually save those values. And there's also a reset button. So if you're mid-morph and you want to just automatically switch back to what your values were previously without turning your encoder knob, just press that button. It'll figure all the shit out for you. It's good. I've also added a knob to MIDI Goblin. It's not a big deal, but I think people will like it. It makes turning the encoder a little bit easier. Now, as for the expected shipping date, it's still in October, although at this rate, it's probably going to be late October. I've added a lot of new things to MIDI Goblin, but they're worth the wait. Unless there's some sort of major change, or major problem, totally unexpected, expect them late October. I'll communicate much more effectively on this as time progresses, but things are looking pretty good right now. And now that I'm confident I can get MIDI Goblins out the door in sometime in October, I feel comfortable opening up a pre-sale store. The pre-sale store will be done through BackerKit. BackerKit can use some of my data from Kickstarter as well, so it's a pretty good option for me. It also means I don't have to set up a pre-sale store myself while I'm doing all this other stuff. But there will be a price increase. If you missed the Kickstarter campaign, I'm sorry, but this is the way it's got to be. I set those Kickstarter prices without really knowing much about import fees or taxes, so $125 is what it shall be. There's been a lot of upgrades to the hardware though. I think that justifies the cost alone. But also, if I was looking at this as just an ESP32 prototyping unit without any of the MIDI Goblin firmware, I'd still pay $135 for it myself. It's got the MIDI connections, a nice PCB, it's got a good enclosure, a bunch of buttons, an encoder, a nice screen. For what you get, $125, pretty good deal, I think. I also need a little bit of money while I'm doing this. I can't really be expected to do it without making any profit, so, your money's going not only to the product, but it's going to me as the creator, so if that's worth it to you, thank you. If it's not, don't worry about it. And that's it for this video. Please do follow me on Instagram if you haven't already. I like to post little snippet story thingamajigs as I add new features to MIDI Goblin. If you like this video, click the like button. If you hate it, click the unlike button. Click the subscribe button too, maybe. Leave a comment if you hate the new price. If you think it's reasonable, maybe leave a nice comment. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the future of this project and really excited for people to finally get their MIDI Goblins. It's going to be really fun.